Chapter 1. The Hidden Code Beneath the Surface. There's a game being played around you, every hour of every day, in every room you walk into, on every screen you scroll, every boardroom you sit in, every date, negotiation, confrontation, and conversation, and unless you've been trained to see it, you won't even know it exists. It's not the words people say. It's not the headlines or the headlines beneath the headlines. It's not the obvious body language you've heard about in self-help books or surface-level tells. It's something deeper, something primal, a hidden architecture behind human behavior, a psychological code embedded in everyone, buried just below the conscious mind, disguised as instinct, emotion, charisma, insecurity, status, certainty, survival. Most people are just reacting to it. But if you can learn to see it, decode it, speak to it, control it, you stop being part of the audience. You start becoming the architect of the room. Because understanding human behavior isn't about being clever, it's about being powerful in a world where most people are led by forces they don't even realize are controlling them. You can't influence what you don't understand. You can't lead what you can't feel. You can't decode someone else until you've had the courage to decode yourself. That's the paradox. The mirror always comes first. So we begin there, not with others, but with you. With your programming. With your perception. With your own invisible patterns, the ones you've called personality, the ones that shaped your responses, your decisions, your tone, your posture, your presence in the world. You think you're choosing your life. But most of the time, your nervous system is choosing it for you. From the moment you walk into a room, before a word is spoken, your mind is scanning, looking for safety, status, trust, threat. It's ancient. It's animal. It's fast. And it dictates how you carry yourself, how you interpret others, how you read a face, a gesture, a silence. You're not just seeing them, you're seeing them through the lens of your own history, your own emotional blueprint, your own unmet needs and unconscious fears. And until you learn to see through that lens, you will never truly see anyone. You will just keep projecting yourself onto them. But once you see that, once you become aware of your own operating system, something changes. You start to watch differently. You start to listen between the words. You start to notice what most people miss: the hesitation in a confident tone, the micro-shift in eye contact, the disconnect between someone's stated goal and the emotion in their posture. You begin to hear the story beneath the story they don't even know they're telling. And that's when you become dangerous. Because now you're no longer reacting. You're reading. You're scanning patterns, motivations, signals, real-time data being broadcast through emotion, logic, silence, inconsistency, pressure. And it's not about memorizing tactics. It's about pattern recognition. Deep pattern recognition. Seeing not just the content of a message, but the structure. Understanding the emotional strategy behind a behavior. Asking not what did they say, but why did they need to say it that way? Not what's their opinion, but what identity are they protecting by expressing that opinion? Because nobody speaks without a motive. Nobody acts without a strategy, even if it's unconscious. And once you learn to decode that strategy, you hold the keys to every interaction, every influence dynamic, every room you enter, for the rest of your life. Look at history. Not the headlines, look deeper. Napoleon read people's insecurities faster than they could guard them. He could enter a room and speak in a way that turned enemies into pawns without lifting a weapon. Carnegie understood power didn't come from force. It came from understanding what people feared losing. He mastered not just steel, but emotion. Disney didn't just sell cartoons. He decoded imagination. He saw the child behind the adult, the hope behind the mask, and built a world that spoke directly to it. None of these people were guessing. They were decoding the human experience in real time. They weren't reacting. They were reading. And in reading, they began to write the script everyone else would follow. You're not here to guess anymore. You're here to see. To see the real motivations behind behavior. To see the unspoken contracts in conversation. To see the psychological structure behind certainty, charm, defensiveness, influence, fear, dominance, silence, need. To understand that human behavior is not random, it is mathematical. Predictable. repetitive, and governed by principles that most people will never take the time to study because they are too busy being governed by them. But you're not most people. You're here to learn the language beneath the language. Because when you learn that, your entire presence changes. You no longer need to speak first. You no longer feel pressure to convince, to impress, to dominate. You let the other person speak. You let the room reveal itself. And while others are trying to be heard, you are hearing everything. Every mask, every signal, every contradiction. You become calm, not because you're passive, but because you're in control. Not controlling them, controlling yourself. And that is the foundation of mastery. But let's not romanticize this. Decoding human behavior isn't a party trick. It's not about becoming manipulative. It's about becoming aware. Because awareness changes everything. Once you see someone's pain behind their arrogance, their insecurity behind their anger, their exhaustion behind their indifference, you stop taking things personally. You start responding strategically. You start speaking to the wound instead of the weapon. And that's what influence really is, not getting someone to agree with you, but getting them to feel understood enough to lower their defenses and choose to hear you. That's why we study human behavior. Not to control it, but to connect to it. To know what moves people not just on paper, but in the parts of themselves they don't even have words for. To walk into a room and feel the energy shift, not because you're loud, but because you're present. Because you've studied. Because you know what most people only guess. And because when people feel seen, they become open. And when they're open, they move. And here's the truth, this isn't about charisma. This isn't about extroversion. This isn't about having some magical gift of influence. This is about discipline. Emotional discipline. Cognitive discipline. The discipline to stop reacting and start observing. The discipline to understand the tension underneath someone's logic. The discipline to ask the question that cuts through someone's entire identity and opens a door they didn't know was closed. The discipline to study people so deeply that you can decode their blueprint in real time and guide the conversation, the deal, the moment, without force, without deception, without fear. Chapter 2. The Mind Behind the Mask. You cannot understand anyone, not truly, until you understand the mask they're wearing and, more importantly, why they're wearing it. Because every human interaction, whether in public or behind closed doors, is filtered through a layer of projection, through a presentation of self that was designed not for authenticity, but for survival. It's not that people want to deceive, it's that they've learned, consciously or unconsciously, that the truth of who they are is either too raw, too unpolished, too vulnerable, or too dangerous to be accepted in full. So they build something to protect themselves. A mask. A role. A social defense mechanism wrapped in charm, silence, intensity, passivity, humor, intellect, anger, agreeableness, whatever works. Whatever keeps them safe. But beneath every mask is a nervous system trying to feel secure. Beneath every posture is a story. And if you only react to the surface, you will never understand the person in front of you. You'll miss the patterns. You'll miss the logic of their behavior. You'll get offended when you should be curious. You'll defend yourself when you should be decoding them. And this is where most people fail, because they believe what they see is the full picture. They listen to tone, not tension. They respond to words instead of context. They fight people's shields instead of understanding their wounds. But if you can learn to look beyond the performance, if you can stop getting triggered by how someone speaks and instead ask yourself, why are they speaking that way, then the world opens up. The same behavior that once confused you now becomes predictable. You see that confidence often masks fear. That silence often screams for recognition. That anger is sometimes nothing more than sadness weaponized by someone who was never taught how to express pain. That humor can be a brilliant disguise for shame. That the loudest person in the room often feels like they are disappearing on the inside. And once you see this, once you train yourself to look at people with X-ray eyes, not judging, not analyzing, just witnessing, you begin to develop what is rarely taught but absolutely essential if you want to influence, lead, connect, and truly decode human beings. Emotional literacy. The ability to read not just the emotion someone shows, but the one they can't show. The one they've buried. The one they are afraid of. The one they've replaced with certainty, aggression, performance, detachment, or busyness. Because here's the truth. Most people aren't being difficult, they're being defensive. Most people aren't trying to control you, they're trying to feel like they're not being controlled. Most people don't even know why they're acting the way they're acting. They're running an emotional program installed years ago, shaped by pain, trauma, validation, repetition, and unmet needs. And until you understand that every human being is carrying an emotional blueprint beneath their behavior, you will keep misreading their intentions and miscalculating your own response. So how do you begin to see the real person, the one behind the persona? You start by studying patterns, not moments. You look for emotional consistency over time, not isolated reactions. One outburst doesn't define someone. One compliment doesn't mean trust. One apology doesn't equal transformation. But repeated behaviors under pressure, that tells you everything. Because pressure reveals identity. When people are uncomfortable, the mask slips. When people feel threatened, the real wiring gets exposed. And your job, if you want to truly master human behavior, is not to react to that exposure. It's to read it, to study it, to map it. Because once you know someone's fear, you know their strategy. Once you know their strategy, you can predict their behavior. And once you can predict behavior, you can guide outcomes without force, because you're no longer fighting people, you're guiding patterns. This is what the greatest communicators, negotiators, leaders, and persuaders understand instinctively. They don't take things personally. They see the game beneath the words. They don't get flustered by tone or urgency or manipulation. They trace everything back to emotional origin. They don't overpower, they redirect. They don't control people, they control the frame. And the frame is always dictated by the person who understands the why behind the what. This is not about being manipulative. This is about becoming accurate, precise, powerful, not by force but by insight. You're not here to trick people. You're here to become someone who sees clearly, who listens between the noise, who can sit in any room and know where the tension is, where the need is, where the leverage is, where the story is trying to be told but hasn't yet found the words. You become the one who knows what others don't say, who sees the wounds they try to hide, who understands that every person is both protecting and projecting, and that to connect with someone authentically, you must be willing to look past the version they've rehearsed and meet the part of them that's still real, still human, still trying to be enough. And you can't do that if your ego is in the way. You can't decode someone else if you're still trying to prove your value. You can't read someone else if your self-worth depends on how they respond to you. That's why the first work is always inner work. You must become so grounded in your own awareness, so fluent in your own emotional language, so secure in your identity and intention, that you no longer need people to respond a certain way in order for you to feel powerful. That's when you become dangerous, not because you control the room, but because you're no longer controlled by it. You no longer react. You respond. You no longer try to win. You aim to understand. You no longer chase validation. You speak from clarity. And from that place, you can look into someone's eyes and truly see them, not the version they wish they were, not the image they project to feel strong, but the actual, vulnerable, pattern-driven, emotion-governed human being sitting across from you. And when you speak to that version, when you match not just their language, but their state, their rhythm, their needs, their emotional logic, they feel it. They drop their guard. They start listening. They start changing. Because we are all waiting for someone to see us, not as we pretend to be, but as we are beneath the performance. And when you become the person who sees that, you earn the right to lead. Not by force. By resonance. Chapter 3. The Laws of Emotional Gravity. If you want to understand people, not just on the surface but beneath the polished narratives, beneath the confident tone and curated appearance, you must begin by understanding this fundamental law. People do not move according to facts, they move according to feeling, and the truth is, emotion governs human behavior with far more authority than logic ever will. Every decision, every reaction, every story someone tells themselves or the world about who they are and what they want is rooted in emotion. Emotion is the gravity of human behavior. It pulls people into actions they can't explain. It orients them around needs they pretend not to have. It distorts their memory, reshapes their values, and becomes the silent engine behind every personal, professional, and social decision they make. And yet most people try to influence others by using data. They try to persuade with rationality. They argue with intellect. They think if they just provide enough logic, the other person will finally understand. But what they don't realize is that emotion always comes first. Emotion decides. Logic justifies. And if you don't speak to the emotional center of someone's experience, if you don't reach that primal core where belief, fear, pride, and identity live, your words will never truly land, because no amount of truth matters if it doesn't feel safe to hear it. That's why most arguments go nowhere. It's not because the other person can't understand, it's because they don't feel understood. Their nervous system is in defense mode. They're protecting a version of themselves they don't want to see shattered. Their opinion isn't just an idea. It's a shield, a disguise, a security blanket. And when you attack it directly, you're not debating, you're threatening the structure of how they feel safe in the world. That's why people shut down, get angry, deflect, ghost, or double down harder on beliefs they don't even fully understand. Because the belief isn't about truth, it's about stability. And the ones who know how to navigate this, the ones who can walk into a charged room, a tense negotiation, a confrontation, or an emotional conversation and maintain composure while guiding the emotional tone, those people control the gravity of the room. They control not by being dominant, but by being tuned in. They don't overpower others with presence. They stabilize them with presence. Their calm is contagious. Their clarity makes others feel safe. Their energy gives permission for tension to melt, for defenses to drop, for the mask to slip just enough that real communication can begin. But to reach this level of psychological clarity, you must first master it within yourself. Because if you don't understand your own emotional gravity, your own triggers, your own blind spots, your own emotional defaults under stress, you will unconsciously project them onto others. You will misread their tension as arrogance, their distance as rejection, their intensity as aggression, their hesitation as disrespect, when really all you're seeing is their nervous system in survival mode. And if you haven't studied your own patterns in those states, you will mistake other people's protective behavior as personal offense, and in doing so, you'll respond defensively and escalate what was actually never about you in the first place. Mastery begins the moment you stop trying to control other people's reactions and start becoming fully accountable for your own. Because once you're not reacting out of fear, once you're not interpreting everything as an attack on your worth, once you've learned to regulate your emotional energy with precision and consistency, then your presence becomes a tuning fork for the emotional field of any conversation you enter. People feel different around you. Not because you say the perfect thing, but because your nervous system communicates calm. Your eye contact communicates safety. Your posture communicates confidence. Your tone communicates control, not over them, but over yourself. And when people feel that, they start to mirror it. This is what leaders do. This is what the most persuasive individuals, the most respected communicators, the most emotionally intelligent people all understand. If you want to change someone's behavior, you must first understand the emotion anchoring it. Because every behavior is an emotional solution to a deeper need. Anger is often a cover for vulnerability. Arrogance is often a strategy to avoid humiliation. Control is often a way to manage fear. Withdrawal is often a survival tactic learned in chaos. And the moment you decode the real emotion, you stop responding to the surface and start influencing the source. You can walk into a meeting and instead of just responding to what's being said, you feel the dynamics underneath. The tension between two people across the table, the pressure someone's under that's affecting their tone, the insecurity behind someone's over-explaining, the unspoken conflict between the leader's vision and the team's unspoken resistance. You no longer wait for words to tell you what's going on. You see it in real time. You read it through patterns, through pacing, through micro-reactions, through energy. And when you operate at that level, you don't need to dominate to win. You don't need to push to lead. You don't need to chase to earn respect. Because you are no longer reacting, you are designing. This is the shift. From reactive to responsive. From unconscious to intentional. From guessing to reading. From trying to be persuasive to becoming deeply aware of how humans actually operate, not how they say they operate, but how they actually respond when emotion takes the wheel. Because logic doesn't run the show. Emotion does. And if you don't understand that, you will keep talking at people instead of speaking into them. So train your eyes to see more than behavior. Train your ears to hear more than words. Train your nervous system to remain grounded when others spiral. Train your intuition to decode what's not being said. Because the real truth, the truth behind persuasion, behind leadership, behind decoding anyone in seconds, is that the one who understands emotion understands everything. Chapter 4. The Identity Engine. Human behavior, at its core, is not driven by logic, environment, or opportunity. It is driven by identity. The way people act, speak, respond, and navigate the world is dictated by who they believe they are, and who they believe they need to be in order to belong, to survive, to win, or to avoid pain. This identity is not always consciously chosen. In fact, most of the time, it isn't. It's shaped slowly, subtly, and powerfully through thousands of interactions, experiences, rewards, rejections, stories, and silent emotional conclusions a person draws about what is acceptable, valuable, respected, and safe. Identity becomes the internal compass that tells someone what their role is in the world, and once that internal story is written, behavior becomes predictable, because nobody acts against their identity for long. The identity always wins. If someone sees themselves as a failure, they will unconsciously sabotage opportunities that contradict that identity. If they see themselves as a victim, they will interpret every challenge as confirmation of their powerlessness. If they see themselves as a leader, they will step forward even when they're unsure. If they see themselves as someone who can't be trusted, they will create situations that validate that belief. This is not theory, this is behavioral law. And if you want to truly decode someone, to understand what's driving them beneath the logic and emotion, you must go deeper, into the identity level, into the self-image they're protecting or projecting or overcompensating for. Because no matter what someone says, no matter how they act on the surface, what they are really doing is maintaining coherence between their inner identity and their outer reality. If those two things ever drift too far apart, the person will experience an identity crisis. They'll either upgrade their self-image to match their new life, or they'll destroy their progress to return to the identity that feels familiar. And familiarity, even when it's painful, is often chosen over growth, because familiarity is safe, predictable, and the nervous system loves what it can predict, even if it means reliving the same cycles again and again. That's why some people can succeed in one area but constantly crash in another. That's why someone can start a business, gain momentum, then abandon it. That's why someone can enter a healthy relationship and then slowly dismantle it. That's why someone can receive praise and instantly feel anxious instead of proud. Because the outer world is expanding beyond the self-concept, and unless that inner identity is reprogrammed, the expansion won't hold. They'll return to the emotional home they're used to, the one that matches the identity they've rehearsed, whether it's strong or broken. So when you're decoding human behavior, don't just watch what people do, look for the identity they're serving. Ask yourself, what kind of person do they believe they are? What version of themselves are they defending in this moment? What belief about themselves are they proving with this action, this tone, this silence, this outburst, this withdrawal? Because when you see that, you see the blueprint. And when you see the blueprint, you can predict the next move. You can lead them into a new frame. You can offer language, insight, and presence that speaks not to the action, but to the identity driving it. But you can't do this if you haven't done it for yourself. If you haven't examined the identity you're still carrying, the one you built to survive, the one you built to please, the one you built in the absence of guidance or the presence of criticism. Most people are still living according to a self-image that was installed years ago, never questioned, never updated. And they wonder why they feel trapped, why they can't grow, why they sabotage breakthroughs. It's because the external world can never consistently exceed the internal identity. You will always return to the version of yourself you believe is most true. And yet, identity is not fixed. It feels fixed because it's reinforced through repetition. But if you change the inputs, your thoughts, your language, your environment, your behavior, you start changing the image. You start updating the belief. You start rewriting the story. You start behaving in alignment with the person you want to become, not through force, but through deliberate design. That's what true personal transformation is. Not just learning new skills. Not just achieving more goals. But installing a new identity that matches the future you're building. Because once the identity shifts, the behavior becomes effortless. You're no longer forcing habits. You're just expressing who you already believe you are. And when you operate from this level, when you see identity as the core driver, you stop arguing with people about their behavior. You stop trying to guilt them into change or convince them with logic. You start influencing them at the root. You start offering them new mirrors, new narratives, new environments, new feedback loops that help them see themselves differently. Because people change fastest not when they're told what to do, but when they see a new version of themselves reflected back to them with clarity and safety. That's what the great persuaders, coaches, leaders, therapists, and communicators all understand. They're not just managing behavior, they're shaping identity. They're holding space for a person to let go of a self-image that's no longer serving them and step into a version of themselves they were always capable of becoming, but never had the right frame to access. And that's what you're doing when you master this. You're not just reading people. You're helping them remember who they really are. Because beneath every mask, beneath every pattern, beneath every behavior, there is a human being built for more, waiting for someone, not to fix them, not to control them, but to see them clearly enough that they can finally see themselves. Chapter 5. The language beneath the words. Every word spoken, every phrase chosen, every sentence constructed by a person in conversation, whether casual or critical, carries with it far more than just information. It carries emotional residue, identity signals, psychological defense mechanisms, unresolved history, learned power dynamics, internal hierarchies, and unconscious needs. And if you're only listening to what someone is saying, if you're only focusing on content without tuning into context, cadence, tone, timing, and structure, then you are missing at least 90% of what's really being communicated. Because language, in the hands of someone unaware of their own patterns, becomes a mask, a cover, a way of maintaining emotional safety while creating the illusion of connection. And if you want to decode human behavior in real time, if you want to become the kind of person who can hear the truth hiding in plain sight, then you must train yourself to stop listening for facts and start listening for structure. Because people don't speak how they think, they speak how they cope. They speak from the emotional state they're in, not the rational truth they might later come to recognize. Language is reactive. It is expressive. It is protective. Someone who is punished for being direct might wrap everything in softeners, qualifiers, vague metaphors, or excessive politeness. Someone who was ignored may speak in long, run-on monologues that rarely land. Someone who was attacked may speak only in short, sharp fragments, hoping to end the moment before they're exposed. And none of this is random. All of it is adaptive. Language is learned survival. And if you pay close attention, you'll begin to realize that how someone says something reveals more than what they're actually saying. That's why the most emotionally attuned communicators, the ones who truly understand how to shift dynamics and influence minds, listen to language differently. They track the energy underneath the sentence. They hear the word choices not as decorations, but as clues. They hear a just at the start of a sentence as a sign of minimization. They hear a I don't know not as confusion, but as self-protection. They hear contradictions between the words and the tone, between the confidence and the cadence, and instead of reacting, instead of correcting, instead of judging, they ask themselves, what is this person not saying directly? What is this person trying to avoid? What are they asking for without asking? What identity are they defending through these words? Because underneath every conversation is a deeper layer of conversation, one where control, approval, safety, and validation are being negotiated invisibly. People say they want honesty, but what they really want is honesty that doesn't challenge their self-concept. People say they want feedback, but they only want it delivered in a tone that doesn't activate their shame response. People say they're fine, but their breathing, their eyes, their timing says otherwise. And most people miss this, not because they're careless, but because they've never been trained to read language on multiple channels. But when you develop that skill, you stop getting caught in arguments. You stop needing to win interactions. You stop trying to fix surface-level issues. Because now you see that most conversations are not about what they appear to be about. They're not about the topic. They're about trust. They're about emotion. They're about what hasn't been said, what has been suppressed, what has been carried for too long without a safe place to put it. And when you become the person who can hear that layer, when you can reflect it back gently, powerfully, with clarity and compassion, you become a mirror people didn't know they needed. That's why the most powerful communicators often say the least. They let the silence speak. They listen long enough for the other person to drop the mask voluntarily. They ask the right question, not to get a quick answer, but to unlock a door. They understand that when someone says, "I'm fine," but you can feel the tension in their jaw, see the micro-shift in their body, hear the fatigue behind their eyes, you don't need to press, you need to signal safety. You need to hold presence. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. Just being there without judgment, without interruption, without needing to steer the conversation toward your agenda, gives the other person space to unfold. This is the art of decoding. It's not loud. It's not aggressive. It's not about being the smartest voice in the room. It's about being the most attuned. Because the one who is attuned controls the frame, not by force, but by resonance. They feel the room. They feel the pace. They know when to speak and when to wait. They know when a joke is a deflection and when it's a request for closeness. They know when a question is really a test, when an answer is really a boundary, when a word is more about memory than meaning. And that level of awareness doesn't just make you a better communicator, it makes you unshakable in conversations that break other people. You stop getting thrown off by disrespect, because you can hear the insecurity behind it. You stop being swayed by praise, because you can hear the need behind it. You stop taking silence as a rejection, because you can feel the internal processing behind it. You stop mistaking volume for authority and start tracking the emotional intelligence beneath delivery. And most importantly, you stop reacting from your own ego. Because you've trained yourself to observe instead of defend, to inquire instead of attack, to stay curious instead of collapse into judgment. This is what separates amateurs from masters in human behavior. Masters don't just hear, they decode. They don't just listen, they read. They don't just talk, they connect. And once you can do that, not occasionally but consistently, you begin to operate on a level where persuasion is no longer something you perform, but something you embody, because you've learned to navigate the actual terrain that governs every conversation. Not logic, not words, but the deep emotional language that lives beneath them. Chapter 6. The power dynamics behind every interaction. Every interaction you experience, whether it's a handshake, a boardroom negotiation, a glance across the table, a disagreement between friends, a job interview, or a silent exchange between strangers, carries within it an invisible current, an undercurrent of power, not always dominant or oppressive, but always present. Always shaping the emotional tone, the level of honesty, the flow of attention, and the degree of control exchanged moment by moment. And if you don't learn to see that dynamic, if you can't track the shifts in subtle psychological control that unfold inside every conversation, then you are not interacting, you are being directed not by choice, but by blindness to the rules of influence that govern social space. Power, in human behavior, is not just about authority, titles, status, or volume. Power is about frame control, the unspoken agreement of whose perspective is defining reality in this moment. It is the answer to the question, who is shaping the interpretation of what's happening right now? Who is being reactive? And who is directing the emotional narrative of the room? And what you'll quickly learn, once you pay attention, is that the most powerful person in a conversation is almost never the loudest, the most decorated, or the most forceful. It is the person who maintains emotional composure while directing the pace and rhythm of attention. Because power is not what you project. It is what you hold. And it's measured, moment to moment, in how you handle challenge, how you carry silence, how you manage resistance, and how clearly you can enforce your boundaries without needing to convince anyone of your strength. The moment you start arguing for your power, you've already lost it. The moment you try to prove yourself to someone, you've given them authority to determine your worth. And that's where most people lose influence, not in their message, but in their need for external validation to feel in control. Real power is not performance. It's structure. Internal structure. It's built from clarity of purpose, emotional discipline, situational awareness, and the refusal to collapse into someone else's frame just because they raise their voice, challenge your position, or question your certainty. If you don't have that internal foundation, if your identity depends on agreement, if your self-worth is tied to being liked, if your confidence evaporates under pressure, then you will always lose power to the stronger frame, no matter how intelligent you are or how well you prepared. And once you understand this, once you see that power is not something you demand but something you carry, you begin to train yourself to navigate the world differently. You learn to hold tension without breaking rapport. You learn to absorb pressure without reacting emotionally. You learn to let others try to dominate the space while you calmly observe and wait for the opening to redirect the frame with precision. You understand that leadership is not about controlling others. It's about managing the energy of the room so skillfully that people want to follow because your calm grants them certainty in the middle of their own chaos. But none of this is possible if you haven't resolved your own internal power struggles. You can't lead a room if you're still fighting yourself. You can't hold psychological space for others if you're still leaking energy to insecurity, self-doubt, or ego. So the first law of mastering power dynamics is mastering self-regulation. Because people will test you. Life will challenge your frame. Circumstances will attempt to destabilize your inner authority. And if your calm is not real, it will fracture under that weight. You must build a version of calm that isn't quiet desperation masked as politeness, but a true state of embodied strength, a presence that doesn't require noise to be felt. Think of Abraham Lincoln, who walked through civil war with steel in his silence. Think of Nelson Mandela, whose calm after decades in prison became more powerful than any government. Think of Eleanor Roosevelt, whose resolve in rooms full of power brokers wasn't loud, but was immovable. These are not people who talked their way into influence. These are people who carried such deep internal clarity that the world eventually had no choice but to adjust to their gravity. That's what power really is, gravitational pull. The energy you emit that causes others to shift, not because you commanded them, but because your presence makes indecision uncomfortable. And when you learn to manage that energy, when you learn how to read where the power is flowing in a conversation, when to hold it, when to release it, when to match it, when to disrupt it, you become someone who is impossible to ignore. Because people don't remember the facts you said. They remember how they felt in your presence. They remember whether they felt seen, challenged, disarmed, redirected, respected. And when they feel that you're not just trying to win, but trying to guide them toward a better frame, one that includes both of you, rather than just protects your ego, they follow. Voluntarily. So what do you do when you feel that power slipping? When you start to feel triggered, off-center, defensive, rushed? You don't double down. You pause. You breathe. You slow down the rhythm of your speech, because pace dictates perception. You drop into silence if necessary, because silence reframes the conversation without words. You stop proving and start observing. You detach from outcome and reconnect to intent. You shift from, how do I win this moment, to, how do I lead this dynamic? Because power is not about domination. It's about ownership. Ownership of your space. Ownership of your emotion. Ownership of your frame. And when you own yourself fully, other people feel it. Their energy shifts. Their defenses lower. Their resistance fades, not because you forced it, but because your presence was undeniable. And that is the moment when influence begins, not when you speak louder, but when you see deeper. Chapter 7. Certainty and the Illusion of Control. There's a force behind every decision people make that doesn't often get named, but it's everywhere. It shapes choices, builds empires, starts wars, ends relationships, fuels revolutions, and paralyzes entire lives. And that force is the pursuit of certainty. Not truth. Not success. Certainty. Because more than needing to be right, most people just need to feel like they're not lost, like they have ground beneath their feet, like they can explain what's happening and where it's going, even if it's wrong, even if it's fake, even if it's borrowed from someone else. Certainty is emotional oxygen. When people don't have it, they grasp at anything that offers it: rigid ideologies, charismatic leaders, patterns that feel familiar even if they're destructive. Because uncertainty is the one state the human nervous system finds intolerable over time. But here's where the illusion begins. The feeling of certainty is not the same thing as being certain. People confuse conviction with accuracy. They confuse emotional intensity with truth. And the moment someone's need for certainty exceeds their willingness to examine it, they stop being curious and start becoming rigid. Their worldview shrinks. Their tolerance for nuance evaporates. They speak in absolutes. They demand agreement. They filter out anything that challenges their internal order. And what you're seeing in that moment isn't confidence, it's control. It's someone managing the chaos of their internal world by freezing their external one. When you understand this, you begin to see human behavior through a new lens. You realize that most resistance in conversation is not personal, it's structural. You're not arguing with the person in front of you. You're arguing with the psychological scaffolding they've built to avoid uncertainty. You're threatening the framework they're using to stay emotionally afloat. And unless you learn to recognize this, unless you learn to approach these moments with precision instead of pressure, you'll either push them deeper into their defense or lose your own clarity trying to overpower theirs. That's why the art of decoding people requires not just perception but restraint. It's not just about seeing what's driving someone, it's about knowing when and how to challenge it. Because not all truth is useful if it's delivered at the wrong time. People don't change when they're overwhelmed. They don't evolve when they feel attacked. They change when they feel safe enough to question their own certainty without losing their sense of self. And your job, if you want to influence someone at a deep level, is to become the kind of presence that allows that safety to exist, not by being passive, but by being so anchored in your own certainty that you don't need to force it on others. And what does that look like in practice? It looks like being able to sit across from someone who is clearly wrong, who is clearly locked in fear or ego or outdated thinking, and instead of reacting, instead of pushing, you study them. You study what they're protecting. You study what belief their certainty is compensating for. You speak not to their argument, but to the fear underneath it. You reflect back the need behind the need. Because beneath certainty is usually fear. The fear of being wrong. The fear of being unsafe. The fear of being seen without armor. And if you attack the armor, the person tightens it. But if you understand the fear, if you speak with enough emotional intelligence to create space instead of pressure, you give them a path out. One they feel they chose, not one they were forced into. This is influence at the highest level. Not the ability to overwhelm someone with evidence or logic, but the ability to hold your center so fully that others feel safe letting go of theirs. Not because you told them to, but because your calm made it possible. But again, this requires something from you. It requires that you no longer be addicted to certainty. That you no longer need everyone to agree with you in order to feel valid. That you no longer chase control in every room you enter. You must become the person who is comfortable saying, "I don't know," and still standing tall. Who is capable of listening without needing to win. Who is more interested in seeing clearly than being seen as smart. Because the moment you let go of your own addiction to certainty is the moment you become immune to manipulation. You stop reacting to every challenge. You stop collapsing under every disagreement. You stop losing yourself in debates designed to pull you into emotional chaos. You operate from a deeper layer. You listen differently. You see differently. And here's the paradox. When you no longer need control, you often gain it. Because now you're not competing for it. You're radiating it. You're grounded in something stronger than performance. You're living from an internal clarity that can't be destabilized by someone else's opinion, tone, or emotional volatility. That clarity becomes your leverage. It becomes your persuasion. Because people trust what is not shaken. People move toward the presence that isn't reactive. People open to the energy that doesn't flinch. So if you want to decode others, if you want to influence, persuade, lead, or connect at a level most never reach, you must first master your own relationship with uncertainty. You must become someone who can walk into any room, any tension, any conversation, and stay calm not because you have all the answers, but because you trust yourself to navigate without them. That trust is rare. That clarity is rare. That internal strength is what makes you unshakable. And in a world that's addicted to false certainty, the rarest kind of power is the person who no longer needs it. Chapter 8. Emotional Contrast and the Hidden Drivers of Decision. If you want to understand what truly drives people, not what they say drives them, not what they post, not what they perform in moments of curated identity, but what actually causes them to move, to change direction, to commit or retreat, to trust or close off, to act decisively or hesitate indefinitely, then you must learn to recognize the mechanism of emotional contrast, because every major behavioral shift in a person's life is triggered not by logic, not by goals, not even by dreams, but by deep internal recalibration between pain and possibility, between what they want to avoid and what they feel is finally available to them. And unless you see this pattern, this contrast that lives underneath every breakthrough and breakdown, you will mistake words for motivation and totally miss the emotional gravity that's actually running the show. People don't buy because they understand. They buy because they feel relief. People don't change because they realize something. They change because the pain of remaining becomes greater than the fear of moving. People don't leave relationships because of one conflict. They leave because a long-held contrast finally tips. The weight of dissatisfaction overtakes the hope of repair. Every choice a human being makes is an attempt to resolve this emotional tension between what they're running from and what they believe they could run toward. That's the axis of behavior. And the more precisely you can see it, the more accurately you can sense where someone sits on that emotional scale in a given moment, the more clearly you can predict how they'll respond, how much pressure they'll tolerate, how long they'll wait, how open they'll be to suggestion, and what it will actually take to move them. Because until that contrast shifts, nothing changes. You can inspire, you can advise, you can explain, and it may even be heard, but it won't land deep enough to cause movement. Because movement only comes when the emotional structure underneath someone's reality begins to destabilize. When their current pattern of behavior no longer gives them what they need emotionally, and the new path, whatever you're offering, suggesting, or embodying, begins to feel like a more compelling resolution to their discomfort. And here's the key. People don't always know this is happening. In fact, most of the time, they don't. They're not sitting there analyzing their internal cost-benefit analysis in clean language. It happens faster, more emotionally, more subconsciously. They just feel drawn to something or repelled from it. They just feel stuck or suddenly free. That feeling, the one they might describe as instinct, chemistry, resistance, urgency, that feeling is the surfacing of emotional contrast. It's the nervous system processing tension and signaling that change is either threatening or necessary. This is why influence doesn't start with speaking. It starts with sensing. If you can sense where someone's emotional leverage points are, you can guide the conversation far more effectively than someone who's armed with endless talking points but has no read on the internal climate of the other person. And sensing this isn't magic, it's pattern recognition. It's emotional literacy. It's the trained ability to feel how open or closed someone is, how safe they feel in the moment, how much unresolved pressure they're holding, how their current environment or belief system is either feeding or starving their deeper needs. Because human beings are driven by unmet needs. Boys. Every word, every habit, every hesitation is a signal pointing to a need they're trying to meet or avoid admitting they have. And those needs don't always come out clean. Sometimes the need for validation shows up as overconfidence. Sometimes the need for connection shows up as withdrawal, because past vulnerability led to pain. Sometimes the need for control shows up as perfectionism, disguised as high standards. And if you can't read that contrast, if you can't feel what someone is actually protecting themselves from while pretending they're fine, you'll get locked in surface-level exchanges that never reach the level of influence you're capable of. But when you can see it, when you learn to read the difference between what people say they want and what they actually need to feel safe enough to move, you become someone they trust, not because you promised them answers, but because you offered them resolution. You gave language to the emotion they couldn't name. You reflected back the contrast they couldn't organize. You help them see that the tension they feel is not a sign they should freeze. It's a signal that it's time to act. And when you live from that level of perception, you also start managing your own emotional contrast differently. You stop waiting for perfect circumstances to begin. You stop fantasizing about the future as a way to escape the discomfort of the present. You stop letting fear override possibility just because the path is unclear. You recognize that every time you've made a meaningful move in your life, it wasn't because someone gave you a perfect pitch, it was because something inside you snapped. The pain became too loud. The pressure became too real. The desire became non-negotiable. And you decided that staying still was no longer acceptable. That's the inflection point for all change. And if you want to be someone who can lead people there, who can see it, hold it, and speak to it, you must first be honest enough to track it in yourself. Where are you still tolerating a life that's just comfortable enough to justify staying the same? Where are you pretending to be logical when you're actually scared? Where are you waiting for certainty when the contrast is already telling you it's time to move? Because once you live from this level of awareness, once you see that human behavior is nothing more than the resolution of emotional contrast, you begin to read people differently. You stop asking what they want. You start asking what they fear. You stop convincing. You start listening. You stop pushing. You start pulling, gently, strategically, and with clarity. Not because you're trying to manipulate, but because you understand the structure of transformation. And that's the edge. The edge between a communicator and a true persuader. The edge between surface-level interaction and deep behavioral insight. The edge between noise and mastery. And the moment you cross that edge, you'll never go back to guessing again. Chapter 9. The Unspoken Contracts of Human Behavior. Every human relationship, personal or professional, romantic or transactional, brief or lifelong, is built not on the surface of what is said, but on the quiet gravity of what is not said, on the unspoken psychological agreements that define what is allowed, what is expected, what is safe, what will be tolerated, and what will be punished, not formally, not explicitly, but emotionally, through signals, patterns, silence, tone, and consequence. These are the invisible contracts that govern behavior between people, the subconscious understandings that determine whether someone leans in or pulls away, whether they trust you or build walls, whether they bring their full truth to the conversation or just enough to protect themselves. And unless you become aware of these hidden agreements, unless you learn to read the contract that's being signed emotionally before a word is ever spoken, you will continue to misinterpret the most important dynamics in your life and wonder why your influence never reaches its full potential. Because people don't respond to what you say, they respond to the emotional agreements they've made with themselves and with you. And these agreements are often formed in milliseconds, based on emotional cues, how you looked at them when they spoke, whether your body language signaled approval or threat, whether your attention was present or divided, whether your energy said, "I see you," or "you're just a means to my end." And once that emotional contract is made, it dictates everything. It defines the rules of engagement. It defines what part of themselves they'll show you. It defines whether they will comply, resist, surrender, pretend, or disappear. And if you're unaware of this, if you're stuck believing that relationships are only about logic, or that communication lives only in words, you'll miss the most critical leverage points in human behavior. Think of how quickly people size up a room. Think of how fast someone decides, "I can't be myself here," or "I need to perform," or "This person reminds me of someone I had to protect myself from." That decision doesn't come from thought. It comes from pattern recognition. It comes from trauma. It comes from emotion. And once it's made, it's very hard to undo. Because the nervous system is not interested in fairness. It's interested in survival. And the contract it signs is designed to minimize pain. That's what most human behavior is: prevention. Not expression. Not truth. Prevention of pain. And if you want to decode someone in seconds, you don't ask what they want, you ask what pain they are avoiding. You don't ask what their goals are, you ask what patterns they're unconsciously preserving because they made a contract long ago that said, "If I act this way, I'll stay safe." Now, here's the real insight. These contracts are almost never revisited unless challenged. Most people are still operating under emotional agreements they signed when they were 7, 10, 15 years old. Agreements like, I must never be too much, or, if I speak up, I'll be attacked, or, if I'm vulnerable, I'll be abandoned, or, if I outshine others, I'll be resented. And these beliefs, which once helped them adapt, now limit every conversation, every risk, every opportunity for connection. And if you want to become a true master of human behavior, you need to be able to feel when someone is speaking from an outdated contract. You need to be able to sense the hesitation that doesn't match the situation. You need to be able to see the overreaction that's not about you but about a script they've been playing for decades. And then, when the moment is right, you speak directly to that contract. Not with confrontation, but with presence. You mirror it. You name it gently. You offer them a new agreement, not through force but through your example. You show them that in this space they are not being punished for truth. They are not being rejected for vulnerability. They are not being controlled by shame. Because your calm, your clarity, your grounded presence is making a new contract available, one where dignity is not earned through performance but honored by design. But to do that, you have to tear up your own outdated contracts. You have to stop signing agreements with people that say, I will hide my power so you're comfortable, or I will betray my boundaries so you don't leave, or I will pretend not to see what's happening so I can keep the peace. These are the contracts that erode your ability to lead. These are the deals that sabotage your integrity. And the longer you keep them in place, the more resentment, confusion, and inner conflict you will feel. Because power cannot flow through someone who keeps abandoning their own truth to protect someone else's comfort. So if you want to influence others, if you want to be the person who can decode anyone in seconds, not just by analyzing behavior but by understanding what drives it, then start by reading the emotional contracts people are living by, and then decide what you're willing to sign. Because every moment you say yes or no, every time you speak or stay silent, every time you show up with authenticity or withdraw out of fear, you are signing an agreement about how this relationship works, what's allowed, and what role you're going to play in it. And if you don't become conscious of those agreements, someone else will define them for you. But when you do become conscious, when you learn to see the pattern, the fear, the hidden rule beneath someone's behavior, you can gently begin to shift the frame. You can offer a new contract, one that says, in this moment, I see you. Not the version of you you've been forced to become, but the one beneath it. The real one. The one that's still there. The one that doesn't have to perform to be respected. The one that doesn't need to explain itself. The one that knows how to lead, to speak, to stand tall, to connect. You don't have to keep living inside that old agreement. You can choose a new one. Right now. And most people won't hear those words. But they'll feel them. And when they do, the contract begins to change. Chapter 10. Mirrors, Masks, and the Feedback Loop of Identity. Every time you step into a room, speak to another person, exchange a glance, a comment, an idea, you are doing something far more profound than most realize. You are acting both as a mirror and as a mask, simultaneously reflecting back what others expect from you while also projecting the version of yourself you think will be most acceptable, most respected, most safe, or most in control in that particular environment. And until you understand this dynamic, this constant feedback loop between who you are, who you believe you must be, and how others confirm or challenge that image, you will never truly grasp what's shaping human behavior, because people aren't interacting with you, they're interacting with the version of themselves they perceive in your presence, and how they feel about that version determines everything. Their openness, their resistance, their trust, their defensiveness, their tone, their honesty, and even their memory of the conversation. You see, identity is not fixed, it's fluid, constantly being validated or threatened through social interaction, constantly reinforced or rewritten by the emotional signals we receive, constantly shaped by the perceived roles we think we're being assigned by the people around us. That's why some people act confident around certain people and small around others. It's not about inconsistency, it's about identity resonance. Who they become is a reaction to the psychological environment they're in. They are responding to the mirror, to the silent signal of, this is who you are here. And unless you learn to see that, unless you develop the awareness to recognize that behavior is a reflection of internal identity mirrored through external perception, then you'll continue to misread people in real time. Think about it. Why do people act differently around their boss than around their closest friend? Why do some become performative in groups but sincere in solitude? Why do some become more grounded in chaos while others unravel under the same pressure? It's not about morality or intelligence, it's about the roles people believe they're being cast in. And those roles are shaped not just by the person in front of them, but by the frame the other person is holding. If you treat someone like they are powerful, they begin to mirror that role. If you subtly signal that someone is less capable, their confidence shrinks, even if you never say a word. People are not just responding to what you say, they're responding to who you silently tell them they are. This is where mastery begins, not with speaking but with framing. Not with manipulation but with awareness. When you understand that you are always broadcasting a psychological signal, one that others interpret through their own emotional filter, you begin to take responsibility for the mirrors you hold. You stop blaming others for being reactive when you've been unconsciously signaling threat. You stop judging others for being insecure when you've been subtly diminishing their power. And you start learning how to build identity resonance, how to hold a frame so clean, so grounded, so intentional, that others begin to rise into it simply because they feel safe being seen in a version of themselves they haven't yet fully claimed. Because the truth is, most people are wearing masks they no longer want to wear, but they're afraid of what will happen if they take them off. They're afraid that the moment they do, the room will reject them, the deal will fall apart, the respect will evaporate. So they keep performing. They keep pretending. They keep showing up as who they think they need to be. And if you don't give them a different kind of mirror, a different kind of energy, a different kind of presence, one that makes it emotionally safe to be authentic, they will never drop the act. But if you do, if you walk into the room and hold presence instead of pressure, if you offer clarity instead of critique, if you stay rooted while others perform, if you speak to their potential instead of their defense, then something remarkable happens. The mask loosens. The performance cracks. The identity underneath begins to breathe again. And that's when real conversation begins. That's when transformation becomes possible. Not because you forced it, but because your presence made it safe. This is what the best leaders do. This is what the greatest therapists, coaches, negotiators, and communicators understand. They don't just speak, they frame. They don't just push, they listen. They don't just direct behavior, they reflect identity. They become such clear mirrors that people can finally see themselves without distortion. And when someone sees themselves clearly, even for a moment, the old narrative begins to lose its power. But again, none of this works if you are still wearing a mask you haven't questioned. If you walk into the room trying to be impressive, trying to be right, trying to be the smartest person in the conversation, your presence becomes conditional, and people will sense that condition instantly. They will mirror your tension. They will perform their roles. They will protect their image. And the entire interaction will remain surface level. So if you want to decode others, if you want to be the person who can read behavior, lead energy, and shift identity in real time, you must first drop your own performance. You must become so grounded in your own clarity, so emotionally honest with your own motives, so aware of your own framing, that others feel it before you even speak. That's the real signal. That's what people trust. Not your words. Not your strategies. Your being. And the more authentic you become, not as a tactic but as a state, the more clearly you will see the masks others are wearing. And the more powerfully you can help them remove them, not through confrontation, but through presence. Because the greatest transformation in human behavior doesn't happen when someone is told what to change. It happens when they are finally given permission to become. Chapter 11. Persuasion without force, the architecture of invisible influence. True persuasion, the kind that reshapes beliefs, redirects behaviors, transforms resistance into alignment, and builds trust without demand, is not loud, it's not aggressive, it doesn't rely on pressure, manipulation, or clever tactics that feel mechanical and hollow when applied without understanding. Real persuasion is invisible. It works because it's structural, not superficial. It happens beneath the conversation, not within it. It takes place in the space between words, in the tone beneath the logic, in the emotional scaffolding you've learned to build long before the other person realizes they've already begun to change their mind. Because people don't move because of facts, they move because of how those facts feel. They don't follow because of your authority, they follow because of the frame you create, the reality you establish, the world you invite them to step into without feeling like they're being pulled or tricked. And that frame, your frame, is everything. Because the person who holds the frame controls the conversation. Not through volume, but through clarity. Not through dominance, but through certainty, the kind that is internal, not performative. Not the kind that needs to convince others in order to stay intact, but the kind that can allow disagreement without losing integrity. Because people don't trust what you force, they trust what you embody. And if you don't understand that, you'll keep trying to push people into decisions rather than becoming the kind of presence that pulls them into alignment. This is why persuasion at its highest level begins long before the pitch. It starts the moment you walk into a room. Because before you speak a single word, the other person's nervous system is already making decisions about whether you are safe, whether you are clear, whether you are a threat, a teacher, a mirror, or just another performer. They are scanning for cues, nonverbal, energetic, behavioral, that tell them who they need to be in your presence. And that determines everything. Because people adjust not to what you say, but to who you are. If you are anxious, they feel pressure. If you are performative, they become guarded. If you are desperate for approval, they will feel superior and start testing you. But if you are calm, clear, grounded, if your emotional state is stable and unshakable, people will begin to mirror that. They will start softening. They will begin listening, not because you forced them, but because your energy gave them permission to lower their defenses. This is why you cannot influence someone else if you're still emotionally reactive yourself. You must build a foundation that is so internally structured that nothing in the other person's behavior can destabilize you. And that means knowing your own triggers. It means mastering your tone. It means being aware of the power of timing. Because great persuaders speak in rhythm, not just reason. They know when to pause, when to lean in, when to ask, and when to wait. They don't rush the conversation. They allow the emotional tempo to unfold. And they watch closely, because every reaction from the other person is feedback. Not feedback to judge, but to interpret. Because if someone resists your idea, they're not rejecting you. They're protecting something inside themselves that your idea is threatening. Maybe it's their identity. Maybe it's their status. Maybe it's their sense of certainty. And your job, if you want to truly persuade, is not to fight that resistance. It's to understand it, to read the emotional cost of change and reduce it through empathy, through clarity, through framing. Because persuasion is never about forcing your truth onto someone. It's about making their truth less painful to evolve. That's why asking the right question is more powerful than giving the right answer. Because the right question lets the person discover the insight themselves, and people only integrate the truths they feel they've chosen. Tell someone what to do, and they resist. Guide them towards seeing it on their own, and they defend it like it was always their idea. That's invisible influence. That's behavioral architecture. You don't argue with the surface, you reshape the frame. You don't overpower resistance, you redirect its momentum. You don't dominate the space, you design the emotional structure that makes the outcome feel inevitable. And to do that, you need to stop seeing persuasion as a moment and start seeing it as a process. It starts with emotional safety. It builds through consistency. It lands through timing. And it holds only when there is trust. But trust doesn't mean compliance. Trust means that someone feels you are not using their uncertainty against them, that your presence isn't conditional, that you don't need to win in order to feel okay, that you are offering insight, not transaction, that your clarity is real. Because persuasion without force is the most powerful kind. Not because it bypasses logic, but because it transcends ego. And once you learn to lead with that level of precision, once you learn to speak into people's resistance without pushing on it, once you master the rhythm of influence, once you stop needing to be right and start aiming to reframe, then you become the kind of person who doesn't just communicate powerfully, but who reshapes belief systems by the way you show up, not just the words you speak. That's real mastery. That's what it means to decode human behavior and guide it, without force, without manipulation, without needing to control the outcome. You don't win because you force people into your world. You win because you build a world they want to walk into. Chapter 12. Becoming the one who sees. There is a moment in every person's life, though few recognize it when it happens, where the veil of automatic behavior lifts, even if only slightly, and for a brief instant they become aware not just of others, not just of the patterns around them, but of themselves, fully, honestly, without excuse, without narrative, without protection. It is the moment you stop reacting and begin seeing. The moment you stop performing and begin perceiving. The moment you stop trying to win conversations, gain validation, control perceptions, and instead you sit in stillness with the truth that has always been there beneath the noise. That your entire life, every relationship, every argument, every fear, every triumph, every loss, has been shaped not just by what happened to you, but by how you interpreted it, and how those interpretations solidified into identity, into expectation, into the unconscious laws you started obeying without ever realizing you agreed to them. And from that moment forward, nothing feels the same. Because now you see it everywhere. In the way people interrupt each other not because they're rude, but because they're terrified of not being heard. In the way someone's anger isn't aggression, it's grief. In the way someone's arrogance isn't confidence, it's armor. In the way someone stays silent not because they have nothing to say, but because at some point in their life, silence became safer than truth. You begin to realize that people aren't difficult. They're just protecting something. That beneath every behavior that frustrates you, there is an emotional contract that person has signed with themselves. One that made sense at the time, one that helped them survive, one that now keeps them confined. And once you see this, you stop getting pulled into drama. You stop reacting to tone. You stop internalizing people's projections. Because now you can see it. You can see what's really happening. And this seeing, it changes everything. You begin to walk into conversations with presence, not performance. You begin to ask questions not to steer, but to reveal. You begin to listen not for the right moment to speak, but for the moment someone's defenses soften just enough to allow truth in. You become someone who leads, not by authority, but by awareness. You lead not because you want to be followed, but because you've cleared the noise inside yourself long enough to hear what others cannot say out loud. You stop needing to be impressive. You stop needing to dominate. You stop playing power games because you understand where real power lies. It lives in your ability to remain centered when everyone else is spinning, to stay clear when others are fogged by emotion, to see through masks without tearing them off, to invite someone out of their performance without shaming them for wearing it. And as you embody this way of being, not just occasionally, not just when it's easy, but as a state, the world begins to respond differently. People open to you. They soften. They reveal. Not because they're weak, but because they recognize that your presence doesn't require them to hide. You become a mirror, a quiet force, a grounding rhythm in conversations that used to spiral into tension and confusion. You no longer try to decode behavior from the outside in. You understand it from the inside out. Because now you know, people move when they feel seen. They change when they feel safe. They trust when they feel that their truth won't be used against them. And you provide that not through manipulation, not through tricks, but through who you are. This is the highest level of mastery. Not reading people to outsmart them. Not decoding behavior to exploit it. But understanding people deeply enough that you can guide them, gently, firmly, respectfully, out of the limitations they didn't even know they were living inside. You become the one who sees, not as an observer on the outside, but as a participant who has done the work within. You've faced your own masks. You've dissolved your own contracts. You've navigated your own emotional contrast. You've challenged your own need for certainty. You've let go of persuasion as a performance and learned to lead through resonance. And now you walk differently. You speak differently. You listen differently. Because when you see clearly, you don't need to speak as much. When you trust yourself, you don't need to be loud. When you understand human behavior at its root, you stop trying to change people and start creating the conditions in which they change themselves. This is what it means to master human behavior. Not just to understand others, but to become someone they trust enough to be themselves around. Someone whose presence is the shift. Someone who can walk into any room, any conflict, any moment of resistance, and without needing to control or overpower, bring clarity simply by being it. Because once you see, you can never unsee. And from that moment forward, you don't chase influence. You are it.